Welcome to History Shittiest Disciple, the shittiest place to learn about philosophy or anything else in the world. So I talk about philosophy, self-help, masculinity, and anything related to my opinions. So today we're going to be talking about the David Hume's is-ought problem. So according to Wikipedia, or just about any source you can find, the is-ought problem, as articulated by Scottish philosopher and historian Dave Hume, states that many writers make claims about what ought to be based on statements about what is. Hume found that there is a significant difference between positive statements about what is, factual statements, descriptive statements, and prescriptive or normative statements about what ought to be, and that it is not obvious how one can be coherently moving from descriptive statements to prescriptive ones. The is-ought problem is also known as Hume's law or Hume's guillotine. So I want to explain a few things really quickly. So if this is not easy to understand, let me know down in the comments down below. I have a few visuals to try and break down the is-ought problem. So steps to avoid the is-ought problem. So we have the steps, the statement and how it's sort of written, and then the type of statement. So step 1 is, it is, and it can also be written as if it is. It is a fact, a description, and that is an is statement. So step 2 is if or if it is, and it's a scenario of the fact. And I haven't fully thought it through, but I think generally it's an opinion or a value, if not always. Step 3 is written as you ought or we ought. It can also be he or she ought, but I didn't bother with writing that. As for the type of statement, it's not always an action, although it can be an action. But it's always a conclusion, a goal, a prescription, and that is our ought statement. So to make this very simple with this diagram, your is statement is step 1, and then that is followed up by your if statement, which is a scenario of the fact, which leads to your conclusion, which is your step 3, your ought statement. There's a few different ways we can summarize the is-ought problem into a sentence. Now, I just wanted to say, generally speaking, when people summarize it into a sentence, they're summarizing it based off their current world knowledge. We ought not get an ought from an is an improper way to say it. An ought cannot come from an is a proper way to say it. Now, we ought not get an ought from an is. This wording means you should not, but you can or might be able to get an ought from an is. An ought cannot come from an is. This means we cannot get an ought from an is. With the current world knowledge that we have now, most people who believe in David Hume's guillotine do not believe it is possible to get an ought from an is without falling into absurd logic. I wanted to clear up one little bit of confusion. You might think to yourself that we are getting an ought from an is by saying an ought cannot come from an is. That by us saying an ought cannot come from an is, we are using an ought to get an is. But that is an ought statement. You can use an ought to get an is, but you cannot use an is to get an ought, is another way to say it. If it is the case you're in a race, which is the is statement, if you wish to lose the race, which is the next statement, and that's a value or a scenario of the is, you ought to move slow enough to lose. So that's if you wish to lose the race. Now, let's go with what most people think about when they think about racing. If it is the case you're in a race, and if you wish to win the race, so we have our is statement, which is our fact or description. Then we have our second one, which is our scenario of the fact or the description, our if statement. And now we have our prescriptive statement. You ought to move fast enough to win. So this is not about appealing to what most people think about when they think about a race. Most people might be in a race to win it, sure, but we don't necessarily know that without actually knowing what that person's values and goals are within the race. Now, if I had an is and then an ought, without any extra if statement, it wouldn't actually make any logical sense, and I hope this message gets across. You might think to yourself, who wants to lose a race, right? Well, maybe you have someone who you want to encourage, so you might want to lose a race to sort of encourage them. Or maybe you're being competitive with somebody, and you really want to try and win against them, therefore you might try to want to win. Who's to say what you ought to do or ought not to do without knowing that person's values or your values? Now, before I end this, I just want to say, whenever somebody runs into the is-ought problem, it can lead to other fallacious problems and other unsound reasoning. Now, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, remember to think for yourselves and have an amazing 24 hours.